They saw me as the silent woman with the mop, a ghost in the halls of a multi-billion-dollar empire, never suspecting that I had spent 5 years recording every illegal move they made. By the time they realized I wasn't just cleaning their floors, I had already gathered enough evidence to send them all away for an enormous stretch. The floorboards of the executive boardroom always squeaked in the exact same spot, right beneath the mahogany table where the world's most powerful people sat to decide the fate of companies worth billions. I knew every creak, every stain, and every hidden corner of this floor. For 5 years, I had been the silent phantom of the 40th floor. I was the help. I was the woman in the gray uniform who carried a bucket and a mop, whose presence was so mundane that I became invisible. To the junior analysts, I was a background prop. To the board of directors, I was barely human, just a pair of hands that cleared away their lukewarm coffee cups and wiped the smudges of their ambition off the glass walls. My name is Elena, or at least that's what they call me. I spend my days scrubbing the mahogany until I can see my own tired reflection in it, listening to conversations that could collapse stock markets if leaked to the wrong ears. They talk as if I'm deaf, as if the mop is a veil that hides me from their reality. I've learned their secrets. Which partner is embezzling from the pension fund, which VP is running an organized scheme to hide his personal debts, and who is frantically trying to bury a connection to an illegal weapon shipment that happened in the docks last winter. They don't look at me, but I see them. I see the sweat on their brows when the internal audit reports arrive. I see the panic when they think they're losing control. Life in the shadows has its perks. You learn that power is a fragile, hollow thing. It's built on bluffing and the terror of being exposed. My life, however, was quiet. I went home to a studio apartment that smelled of bleach and peppermint, lived on a modest paycheck, and played the part of the downtrodden cleaner perfectly. I had a debt to pay, a debt born from my father's mistakes, and the only way to clear it was to stay invisible. But invisibility is a double-edged sword. It protects you, but it also strips you of your voice. This Tuesday was different. The air in the building was thick with an unnatural, stifling tension. A private jet had landed at 6 a.m., and the rumor mill in the break room was churning. The god of the Orient, Mr. Kenji Sato, was coming. He was the majority shareholder, the man whose capital kept this sinking ship of a corporation afloat. He hadn't set foot in this office in 10 years. People were scrambling. Ties were straightened, breath mints were chewed, and the office was scrubbed until the smell of chemicals burned the back of my throat. I was finishing up the dusting near the main entrance of the boardroom when the elevator doors slid open with a soft, ominous hiss. A phalanx of security guards in sharp, charcoal suits marched out, creating a path. Behind them walked a man who looked like he had been carved out of cold, unyielding stone. Kenji Sato. He was 80. But he moved with the precision of a predator. The CEO of our company, a man who usually treated everyone with arrogant disdain, was practically trembling as he bowed low, sweat beading on his forehead. Sato didn't look at the CEO. He didn't look at the trembling executives lined up like soldiers. His eyes, sharp as obsidian, scanned the room, ignoring the outstretched hands and the obsequious smiles. Then his gaze locked onto me. I froze, my rag dripping slightly onto the pristine carpet. My heart hammered against my ribs. I turned to walk away, to disappear back into the supply closet, but his voice cut through the room like a blade. It was a low, resonant tone that commanded silence. "Stop!" he commanded. The room went deathly silent. The CEO turned, his face pale, looking at me with a mix of confusion and irritation. "Ignore her, Mr. Sato. She's just—" Sato brushed past the CEO, ignoring his stuttering excuses. He walked across the room, his expensive shoes clicking rhythmically on the floor. He stopped right in front of me. I felt the heat rising in my cheeks, the familiar prickle of fear. I prepared myself to be reprimanded, to be fired, or worse, to be dragged into whatever conflict he was involved in. But then, the unthinkable happened. The man who owned everything, the man who dictated the lives of thousands, stopped a foot away from me. He didn't sneer. He didn't look down on me with disgust. Instead, He did the one thing that shattered the entire social hierarchy of the building in a single motion. He dropped his chin, lowered his shoulders, and bowed, deep, slow, and profoundly respectful, directly to me. The CEO gasped, clutching his chest. The room erupted into confused whispers. I stood there, clutching my mop, staring at the man who had just dismantled my entire existence. And then he looked up, his eyes meeting mine with a flicker of recognition that sent a chill down my spine. "The account is settled, daughter of the dragon," he whispered, his voice too quiet for anyone else to hear. "But they are coming for you now." The silence that followed his words was absolute, a vacuum that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. My grip on the mop handle tightened until my knuckles turned white. Daughter of the dragon. That name hadn't been spoken aloud in 15 years, not since the night the estate burned, the night my family's legacy was turned to ash by an organized scheme that sought to swallow our holdings whole. I had been a ghost ever since, hiding in plain sight, trading my identity for a bucket and a cloth, all to escape the shadow of the charges they'd tried to pin on us. Kenji Sato remained bowed, his posture unwavering. The surrounding executives looked as if they were witnessing a glitch in the fabric of reality. The CEO's face went from pale to a sickly, mottled gray. He looked back and forth between the most powerful investor in the world and the woman who cleaned his toilets, his mind visibly struggling to reconcile the two. "Mr. Sato?" the CEO stammered, his voice cracking. I don't understand. This is just our cleaning staff. There must be a misunderstanding." Sato straightened his suit jacket, his expression hardening back into that impenetrable, stony mask. He didn't glance at the CEO. He didn't even acknowledge the man's existence. He kept his dark, knowing eyes fixed on me. "A misunderstanding is how this firm has survived for so long, Mr. Miller," Sato said, his voice cold enough to frost the glass walls. "You are experts at misinterpreting the value of things. You see a uniform, so you assume poverty. You see a mop, so you assume insignificance. You have been running this company into the ground, hiding behind illegal weapon shipments and shadow accounts, while the person you treated as a servant was the only one who actually understood the ledger." My breath hitched. How did he know about the illegal shipments? I had only ever documented those details in my encrypted private journal, the one I kept hidden beneath the floorboards of my studio. I hadn't even leaked them yet. I was waiting for the right moment, the moment where I could bring the entire structure down on their heads without being caught in the blast radius. "You've been busy, Elena," Sato continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper that only I could catch. "But you've stayed in the shadows too long. The people who destroyed your family aren't just in this building. They've been tracking your digital footprint. They know you aren't just cleaning floors. They know you're the one who has been logging every illicit transaction, every packet of prohibited substances smuggled through the docks, every single attempt to break the law." My heart skipped a beat. "Who?" I managed to choke out. "The very people who hired you for this maintenance gig," Sato replied. "They weren't hiring a cleaner. They were hiring a sacrificial lamb. They knew who you were from the start. They let you live here because they wanted to see who you were reporting to. They wanted to lead you to the rest of your father's old network." The room seemed to tilt. The floorboards, which I had cleaned 1,000 times, suddenly felt like a trapdoor. I looked around the room, the pristine, sterile office, and realized I wasn't just an observer. I was a target. I looked at the security guards standing by the door. They weren't just Sato's men. 2 of them had their hands resting suspiciously close to their holsters, and they weren't looking at Sato. They were looking at me. Sato stepped back, creating distance. "I cannot save you, Elena. I can only offer you the truth. If you stay in this building, you won't make it to sunset. The board has already contacted the authorities to pin the blame for the organized scheme on you. They have the forged documents already sitting in the server room, ready to be discovered by the internal security team." I felt a cold sweat break across my neck. They were framing me, Not just for embezzlement, but for the entire web of criminal activity they had been operating for years. I was the perfect scapegoat, an invisible nobody with no connections, no influence, and a past that could be easily twisted into a motive. "Why tell me now?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Sato leaned in, his obsidian eyes glinting with a dangerous, calculated intensity. "Because I need to know if you have the drive your father had. If you want to survive, you need to leave. Now." "There is a car waiting in the basement, level B3. But before you go, you need to open the emergency archive on the central server." "Why?" I asked, my mind racing. "Because," Sato said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small metallic keycard that hummed with a soft blue light. "If you don't delete the evidence of their involvement, you'll be behind bars for decades before the sun goes down. But if you do, you'll unleash a war." Suddenly, the fire alarm in the building began to scream. The sprinklers sputtered to life, raining water down on the expensive carpet. In the chaos, the executives started to panic, surging toward the elevators. The guards by the door moved, not to evacuate us, but to block the exits. I saw the lead security guard pull out his phone, his thumb hovering over a screen. He wasn't calling the fire department. Sato looked at me, a grim smile touching his lips. "They've locked the doors," it started. "Run, Elena, and for God's sake, don't look back." As I turned to sprint toward the service stairwell, a heavy hand grabbed my shoulder, spinning me around. It was the CEO, his face twisted in a mask of pure, desperate malice. He held a small black object in his hand, a device that looked like a remote. "You thought you were smarter than us? You little rat? You're not leaving this room alive." He pressed the button, and the heavy steel security shutters began to descend over every single exit in the boardroom, trapping us all in a tomb of glass and steel. The sound of the descending steel shutters was like the slamming of a prison gate. Within seconds, the opulent boardroom, a place of glass, mahogany, and lies, was sealed off from the rest of the world. The fire alarm continued to shriek, a discordant symphony to the panic erupting around me. The CEO, Mr. Miller, stood there panting, his face flushed, with a terrifying, unhinged triumph. He still gripped the remote, his knuckles white. "You really thought you could play us, didn't you?" Miller spat, his voice barely audible over the sirens. "A cleaner, a ghost. You sat in the corner with your bucket, listening to us, collecting our words like a scavenger, picking through trash. Do you have any idea what you've stumbled into? This isn't just a corporation, you pathetic worm. This is the heart of an infrastructure that spans continents. You think you're a martyr? You're just a loose end that needs to be cut." Kenji Sato didn't look panicked. He stood perfectly still, even as the water from the sprinklers soaked his expensive suit. He looked at Miller with a gaze so chillingly detached that even the CEO faltered. "You are remarkably short-sighted, Miller," Sato said, his voice cutting through the noise with absolute authority. "You believe you've trapped us. You've only trapped yourself in a cage with a predator who is no longer hiding her claws." I felt a surge of cold, sharp clarity wash over me. The fear was still there, but it had transformed into something else, a cold, focused intent. For 5 years, I had played the role of the invisible victim. I had studied their habits, their weaknesses, and their dependencies. I knew the ventilation system, the manual overrides for the security shutters, and the digital pathways that controlled this floor. I didn't wait for Miller to finish his next sentence. I dropped the mop, the symbol of my fake life, and let it clatter to the floor. As Miller reached into his jacket to pull out a weapon, I moved with a fluidity he hadn't expected. I shoved the heavy mahogany-topped cleaning cart toward him. He stumbled back, startled, and the cart smashed into his legs, sending him sprawling. "Get her!" Miller roared to the guards. 2 of them lunged forward, but I was already moving toward the wall panel concealed behind a decorative panel I'd been eyeing for 3 years. I slammed my fist into the hidden latch. The panel popped open, revealing a series of industrial-grade manual overrides. I didn't need to be a hacker to know how this building breathed. I had been the one to maintain the filters. I ripped the primary power coupling out of its socket, plunging the room into a deep, jarring darkness. The sudden silence was even more terrifying than the siren. The sprinklers cut off. The panic in the room shifted from confusion to blind, primal fear. In the pitch black, I knew the room better than any of them. I could navigate the geometry of the space in my sleep. I felt the rush of the air against my skin as I slipped behind the heavy velvet curtains that lined the eastern wall. "Find her!" someone screamed in the dark. A flashlight beam sliced through the air, wild and erratic. I crawled along the floor, my fingers tracing the familiar indentations of the carpet. I reached the server hub, a massive monolith in the center of the office. Sato was right. If I didn't access the archive now, the evidence of the organized scheme would be wiped before the authorities could ever arrive. My hands shook as I reached into my pocket and pulled out the blue-lit keycard he had given me. Suddenly, a hand clamped onto my ankle. I gasped, swinging my heavy supply kit bag behind me. It connected with a sickening thud against someone's skull. A man groaned and slumped over. I didn't stop. I scrambled up, my pulse drumming in my ears, and jammed the keycard into the console. The terminal flickered to life, bathing my face in a pale, ethereal glow. The data screen flashed. Access granted. I began the transfer. Files started scrolling at a blinding speed. The shipping manifests, the shell company bank statements, the correspondence regarding the illegal weapon shipments. My breath caught in my throat. It was all there. A mountain of evidence that could topple the entire organization. But the progress bar was moving with agonizing slowness. 30%, 40%. A light appeared on the wall. The emergency power had kicked in. I looked up and saw Miller, his face bruised and bleeding from where the cart had hit him, standing just 10 feet away. He wasn't holding a remote anymore. He was holding a sleek silver object, a pistol. He didn't look like a CEO anymore. He looked like exactly what he was, a man protecting his life's work with blood. "That's enough, Elena," he snarled, stepping over the unconscious guard. "You've had your little act of rebellion. It ends here." He raised the weapon, his hand steadying. I looked at the screen. 75% complete. I stood between him and the terminal, shielding it with my body. "If you kill me," I said, my voice steady, "the file finishes uploading. You know how this works, Miller. It's an automated dead man's switch. The second my heartbeat stops, it sends everything to the internal security investigators, the press, and the board. You'll be ruined before the bullet leaves the chamber." Miller hesitated, his finger tightening on the trigger. His eyes darted to the screen, then back to me, his face a mask of conflict. "You're bluffing. You don't have the guts." 85%. "Try me," I whispered. Just as his finger began to squeeze, the heavy doors of the boardroom groaned. Sparks showered from the hinges as something massive slammed into the outside of the office. The entire floor shuddered, and through the reinforced glass, I saw the reflection of a blue and red light pulsing in the hallway. The service doors were being blown off their hinges. "They're here," Miller whispered, his eyes widening in horror. "But they aren't the police." He was right. As the doors fell, the men who entered weren't wearing uniforms. They wore tactical gear with a mark I had never seen before, a mark that belonged to the syndicate my father had been fighting to expose for 20 years. They weren't here to save me. They were here to clean up the mess. And the first thing they did was aim their weapons directly at me. The room descended into a chaotic, silent standoff. The syndicate enforcers stepped through the ruined doorway, their movement calculated and predatory. They weren't there for corporate politics or boardroom power struggles. They were there to ensure that the secrets hidden in the server remained buried forever. Miller dropped his weapon, his arrogance replaced by a frantic, animal terror. He wasn't the CEO anymore. He was just a small man who had played with forces he didn't understand. The lead enforcer, a man with a jagged scar running down his cheek, didn't spare a glance for Miller. His eyes were fixed on the glowing terminal behind me. 95% complete. "Step away from the console, girl," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "You have no idea what you're holding. That data is a death sentence for anyone who touches it." I looked at Sato, who had somehow managed to position himself near the structural pillars of the room. He wasn't reaching for a weapon. He was looking at his watch, his expression calm. Then, the realization hit me. Sato hadn't just given me the key card to expose the company. He had used me as the lightning rod to draw out the entire syndicate. He needed their presence to validate the digital evidence, to turn a corporate scandal into a matter of national security. 98%, 99%. "It's already done," I said, my voice cutting through the tension. The enforcer didn't hesitate. He raised his weapon. I braced for the end, closing my eyes, but there was no sound of a gunshot. Instead, the floor beneath us erupted with a deafening boom, not from explosives, but from the sudden synchronized strike of a tactical intervention team. The ceiling panels burst open, and smoke canisters flooded the room. Flashbangs detonated, blinding everyone. I dropped to the floor, shielding my head as the room turned into a blur of shouting, gunfire, and chaotic movement. When the dust settled, the silence that followed was heavy and final. I blinked, my vision slowly returning. The syndicate enforcers were pinned to the floor by armed responders, the official internal security and federal agents working in perfect, brutal synchronization. Miller was huddled in a corner, sobbing. Kenji Sato stepped over the debris, his clothes torn but his composure entirely intact. He reached down and plucked the key card from the terminal. The screen flashed a bright green success message. Data uploaded to secure government cloud. Audit initiated. "You were a pawn, Elena," Sato said, his voice softer now. "But pawns have a unique quality in a game of chess. They are the only pieces that can reach the other side of the board and become something else entirely." The aftermath was a blur of interviews, testimonies, and the systematic dismantling of the empire I had once cleaned for. Miller and his cronies were led away in handcuffs, facing decades of prison time for their role in the organized scheme. The syndicate's infiltration was exposed, their network dismantled by the very evidence I had uploaded. My father's name was cleared in the public record, his reputation restored as the man who had tried to stop the rot before it took hold. Months later, I stood on the balcony of a high-rise office in Tokyo. I wasn't wearing a gray uniform. I wore a tailored suit, and my hands, once raw from bleach, were steady and clean. I wasn't just Elena, the cleaner. I was the head of a new audit firm that specialized in uncovering the exact kind of deception I had spent years observing from the shadows. Sato joined me on the balcony, leaning against the railing. We looked out over the sprawling city, a sea of lights that felt much less intimidating now that I knew how the currents worked. "The board is still terrified of you," Sato remarked, a rare, thin smile touching his lips. "They think you're still watching them." "I am," I replied, looking back at him. "I always will be." I didn't need to fear the ghosts of my past anymore. I had learned the most important lesson of the boardroom. The loudest voice in the room isn't the one that screams the longest, it's the one that controls the truth. I had started as a shadow in a building full of liars, and I had ended as the architect of their downfall. The mop was gone, the bucket was empty, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for permission to exist. I was the one deciding who stayed and who went, and in this world, that was the only power that mattered. I took a deep breath of the cool, night air, knowing that no matter how deep the secrets were buried, there would always be someone in the shadows waiting to drag them into the light. And for once, it wasn't me. I was the light.